Do you know what's stopping you from doing that one thing you've always wanted to do? You don't, because it doesn't exist. This is Josh Bauer, and no, it really doesn't exist. I plan for this to be a short episode, and basically I'm covering my method for determining what things I should keep, what things I should sell, or what things I should just get rid of by any means necessary. So in order to really make a decision, well, first of all, let's clarify what I'm talking about when I say things. I'm specifically referring to possessions, so things that you own, but this could also be applied theoretically to other things besides just physical possessions. Now, this isn't really particularly important to long-term success, for example, but I do think it can be helpful to people, and this was helpful for me because I had a lot of stuff, and growing up as a kid even, I had a lot of stuff. And then when I eventually moved out on my own and kind of consolidated everything into a smaller space, I had to well, first of all, I had to store all my stuff. I had to move all my stuff. And during that process, I had to make some tough decisions as to what I wanted to keep and bring with me and what I wanted to leave behind, throw out, give away, sell, etc. There wasn't much I was able to sell, but there was a little bit I was able to sell. And when you have a lot of stuff, especially if it's stuff that you care about, stuff that you have a sentimental attachment to, it is often hard to make this decision to get rid of it. And the benefit of getting rid of it would be lower costs of storing it, also less stress over going through your stuff, trying to find stuff. You know, if there's something specific that you're trying to look for and you have 50 totes, it's going to be a lot harder to find it than if you had 12 totes. So narrowing down the amount of stuff that you have can help you find the stuff that you need to find when you're looking for something. Also, it's less stuff that you need to worry about maintaining and taking care of, you know, protecting from cold weather, protecting from animals, rats, anything that can chew through containers and get to it, protecting from theft. The more stuff you have, the more you have to guard it and protect it, and the more you kind of have an obligation to be the caretaker for whatever that stuff is. And I think that it's somewhat of a burden on you, even if you don't really consciously think about it. I think that having a whole bunch of stuff that you need to take care of, especially stuff that you don't need, can be a problem for you in a couple of ways. Again, not substantial in a way that can necessarily adversely affect your life to a significant extent, but nonetheless, I think, again, it's a helpful topic to explore just for the sake of making some minor tweaks in your life that could, you know, improve it in a way that clears up some of your headspace and gives you a little bit more peace of mind, reduces some unnecessary complications, and again, just makes your life more simpler overall. So first of all, these are some of the characteristics that I will assign to any given thing. These are attributes, and then for each one of these attributes, it's a spectrum. How much of it does it have? It can have a little bit of it, none of it, or a lot of it. So the first one is, okay, so if you think financially, you know, there's assets and liabilities. So there's going to be 4 assets or 4 types of assets, 1 type of liability when it comes to attributes of a specific thing. So one attribute that would be an asset is value. And when I say value, I mean financial value. Second one would be utility. Third one would be sentiment. Fourth one would be aesthetics. Okay, those are all assets that all positively reflect on whether or not you should keep that thing. And then on the liability side, it's just simply liability. And liability can take a number of forms. How much money you have to put into it, how much work you have to put into it, how much thought you have to put into keeping it or using it or whatever it may be, how much space it takes up, how heavy it is, and, you know, which would go into how much work it takes to use it because you have to carry it. how much, I don't know, social embarrassment owning it results in. There are a number of different types of liability you could assign to it, but I just group them all into liability. So let's break these down one by one a little bit more and define them. Value, like I already said, is just monetary value. Now, utility, basically, what are you able to do with it? What benefits does it have tangibly, practically in your life? What things get done when you own that? What things are you able to do with that specifically? Sentiment is straightforward. What is your sentimental attachment to that thing? Aesthetics is kind of under the umbrella of utility, but I've included it as a separate category. And the reason I have done so is because aesthetics just means how nice is it to look at. And you could argue that it plays into utility only in the sense that something that is pleasant to look at might increase your happiness in the environment you're in, and therefore it has the utility of making you happier, and that's kind of something that it does. But even with that argument, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that the thing itself is doing that, at least to the point that I think it's worthy of giving it a separate category, because I don't really think, like, if you have a painting on the wall and it looks nice, the painting isn't really doing anything. Just because you look at it and it kind of makes you in a better mood, it kind of has some form of utility in that sense. But at the same time, because the painting isn't doing anything or actively helping you to do anything, I group aesthetics into a completely separate category from utility. And liability, we've already covered the definition in depth. So the question at this point becomes, how do you measure each one of these attributes when it comes to a given possession? And how do you then take those numerical or abstract measurements of each attribute that you've assigned to it and determine what to do with the thing based on your understanding of its liability and assets? So I've never quite come up with a numerical way of analyzing any of these attributes. I don't have a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or anything like that. And maybe you could do that, and I guess it would not, if you wanted to do that, the idea would probably be you have a systematic way of adding up the assets and then seeing if the liability is bigger than the assets or whatever, and then making an objective determination based on the numbers. I think that if you're very mathematically inclined and you like math a lot and you like numbers a lot, then maybe you can play around with that. But I think the problem with it is sometimes you might not accurately assign a number. Like you might, I don't know, let's think of an example. Let's say we have a dresser, right? Okay, let's say it's a nice dresser, so it's got a lot of aesthetics, but aesthetics is not really the primary reason why you would want to keep a dresser. A dresser is mostly for utility. It's for aesthetics in the sense that it takes up empty space, but it's for utility in a sense that it holds books or whatever else you want to put on the dresser. Usually, unless it's an antique dresser or something, the value is relatively minimal to the extent that you wouldn't really give it a high value. Let's say we assign it a $20 value if it's in good condition. And now maybe you bought it for $150, but dressers are just so pleasant, or not pleasant, so prevalent, and so on Facebook Marketplace and whatnot, that the secondhand market for that type of thing, the value isn't going to be really high, in my opinion. So $20 value. The utility is it holds books, and the aesthetics is it takes up empty space and it matches the color of the room or whatever. Sentiment. I don't know, let's say we've had it for 3 years. It has a decent amount of sentiment, but not a ton. Liability, for me, I would say the liability of that sort of object only comes into play when you're moving and you have to move the thing. Otherwise, as long as it's in good condition, it's not taking up more space than is ideal. You don't have, when I say good condition, I mean you don't have to fix a shelf every 2 weeks because it keeps falling off or something like that. I would say the liability is minimal until you have to move it, at which point the liability goes up. But if you try to do a whole numerical analysis, I think it's possible to inaccurately assign numbers in liability that are not proportionate to what you assigned in assets. In other words, if you're really trying to do this in a systematic way just by numbers that you arbitrarily make up and then make an objective conclusion based on the numbers that you come up with, I think you might end up coming to a decision that a logical person might not have come to because you used your numbering system is based on just arbitrary. So I think you should just do it in your head based on logic, not really based on numbers. That's my opinion on the whole number thing. But nonetheless, even though I don't assign numbers to these concepts, I do still think them through quite a lot. Instead of using numbers, let's just use more descriptive adjectives like none, a little, and a lot. Those three make it pretty simple for us to work with and for us to discuss. So let's say an object has zero liability, a lot of utility, a lot of value, a lot of sentiment, a lot of aesthetics. That's an obvious keep. You keep that, right? Why would you not keep it? Now, you could argue if it had a lot of value, I might as well do these in the same order every time to keep it simple and to not confuse people. So zero liability, a lot of value, zero or little to all of the other three assets, which are utility, sentiment, and aesthetics, then you would sell it. So an example of this would be a gold bar. Now, the case in which you would not sell a gold bar is if you wanted to keep it for the purposes of hedging against inflation. Well, a gold bar does not hedge against, arguably maybe it does hedge against inflation, but what it does is it hedges against like an apocalypse or something, or a financial crisis, economy crashes or whatever. So if you're keeping it for that purpose, that would be an argument for not selling it. But in any other circumstance, you would sell that thing. Now, if you have a gold ring, okay, let's go back to the gold bar. The liability would be a little bit. It'd be very minimal, only in the sense that you have to keep it in a safe. You might have to pay a monthly price for a safety deposit box at a bank if you're not willing to keep it in a storage unit or something, or under your bed, because if you keep it in a storage unit or under your bed, then you have the liability of having to make sure you lock your door every time you leave your apartment, or make sure that the storage unit has not only cameras, but make sure that you have a good insurance policy, renter's insurance or whatever it may be, which you then have to pay a monthly price for. So either way, and then if you don't have any of that, then you have the liability of stress, of hoping that nobody steals it. So it has that liability, but aside from that, it's relatively small. You don't have to worry about physical liability. It's not too hard to move, doesn't take up too much space, any of that, right? So minimal liability. Value is very, very high. Utility is very low if it's a gold bar. Now, if it's instead of a gold bar, it's like a semiconductor or something like that that's made out of pure gold, then it would have high utility, but that's not the case. It's just a gold bar. We can say that the sentiment is 0 and the aesthetics is probably 0, or at least very little, right? Now, if it was a ring that was made out of pure gold, the aesthetics would be very, very high, and the sentiment, depending on the context, would most likely be very, very high. Utility would still be low, unless it's a ring with a can opener or something on it, in which case it would still be very low, but you get the point. That kind of goes to the utility versus aesthetics, because you could say, okay, well, the utility of it being on my finger is to represent that I'm in a relationship or whatever, but at the same time, is that really a utility? Is that doing something, or is that just for looks? I would argue that that goes to aesthetics. Either way, whether or not you include aesthetics in utility or have it as a separate category, we could still come to the conclusion that the ring is probably something you would want to keep. So far I've gone through a lot of theoreticals. Let's come back to something that I actually had to make the decision on myself, which is a desk. Now this desk, I've had this desk since I was very, very young, and it had a lot of sentiment to me. It was a wooden desk with metal legs, had a couple different platforms, a couple different shelves, And I've had this desks in multiple different office setups that I've had in my room. And when I say office, I don't mean like corporate office. I mean like I always have little office setups in my room ever since I was probably 11, maybe even younger. And I've had this desk forever, and I've used it forever. So again, it had a lot of sentiment. It had a decent amount of utility for a very long time, in the sense that I used it very, very much for homework and everything throughout school, and then a little bit more besides homework, hobbies and things of that nature. Anything that involved me strategizing and writing stuff down on paper, I would always use that desk. So I had a moderate amount of utility. Like I said, high amount of sentiment. Aesthetics, it did not have a lot of aesthetics. I would put aesthetics relatively low, just because it was definitely kind of beat up and chipped and all that stuff. And the wood, especially when I moved into my newer apartment, the wood color did not match anything else in my apartment, because all my furniture in my apartment I have kind of aligned to be a certain theme and a certain color, and light tan, or it wasn't light tan, it was more like brownish wood color, natural wood color, just did not really fit in with that theme. And so the aesthetics on it was low, especially as I moved into a more modern apartment style. And that also goes to show that some of these attributes can actually fluctuate based on the context around where the thing is going to be. So for example, a hammer might have a lot of utility on Earth, but if you take the hammer and put it on Mars, it's the same hammer, but all of a sudden it doesn't have all that much utility. So one desk can have more aesthetics in a location that matches its color than it would have in a location that does not match its color. So a thing, the attributes of a thing can fluctuate based on its location, just like, the value of something can fluctuate also based on where it is. I don't know if currency is a perfect example. If you take a $20 bill in China, from China, and you have it in America, it's probably, it's not worth this. It's worth less. You'd have to take it to a exchange center or something and convert it. But until you do that, it's not worth anything here. So, and at the same time, even once you do that, it's not that you are certainly making it worth something here. You are giving it away in exchange for something else that is worth something here. So even then, it itself is not really worth anything in America, right? So those types of attributes can fluctuate based on the environment. Going back to the desk, we had moderate utility, high sentiment, low aesthetics. When it comes to value, the value was, because of the poor aesthetics, the value was very, very low, if any. I would peg the value at, honestly, 0, just because of the chips and the way that the structural integrity was starting to kind of give up. This was not real wood. It was like a cork board or whatever, manufactured wood. So the screws were starting to kind of wobble back and forth, and the wood was starting to, the wood surrounding the areas of the screws was starting to get weaker, and the holes were starting to get bigger, so that the screws were not holding their place as much, and the whole desk was getting wobbly and stuff. So the value overall was very low, if anything at all. And so the factor that would make or break whether or not I kept this ended up being liability. Because of the very, very high sentiment, I wanted to keep it, and it kind of was painful to get rid of it. But because of the high liability, I did end up getting rid of it. And what do I mean when I say high liability? Well, movement, transportation, right? That was the very first one. So I had to move all my stuff from way out in the country, like 2.5 hours away, to Buffalo. And so I would have had to move it there, and every time that I carry that thing by myself, it weakens it more and more because of the way I carry it. I end up holding it by areas that are not really supportive of the rest of the thing, and it just bends it more and loosens it even more and weakens it more. And so as I'm trying to move it, the structural integrity decreases, and therefore the utility increases, because if I don't have a sturdy desk, then it's just going to fall over, and at that point there's 0 utility. And then I'm dealing with something that has high sentiment, 0 utility, 0 aesthetics, 0 value, high liability, and because of storage, and that's not something that I can keep at all. The only thing that was, even leading me to keep it before this decision was the higher utility paired with the high sentiment. And the other part of the high liability on that desk would have been storage space. And what do I mean by storage space? I mean, because of the poor aesthetics, I would not have had this in my new office in Buffalo. And so I would have had to keep this in a storage unit. And the only reason I would have stored it was because of the high sentiment. Because keep in mind, if I'm not having it in my apartment because of the poor aesthetics, then automatically the utility drops to 0, because if it's sitting in my storage unit, it's not doing anything. I have another desk that I'm using, and so because I have another desk, the effective utility of this desk at hand is going to be 0, because the thing that it would be doing is already being done by something else, and so there's nothing left for it to do. Even though theoretically it's still a desk and it has the utility of being a desk, it won't be able to execute that utility since that role is already being taken by another desk. And so again, its effective utility is 0. I would have had no reason to keep it other than sentiment. It would have just been sitting in my storage unit, taking up space, and that is a lot of space. It wasn't a huge desk, but it was a desk, right? And so the amount of space it would have taken up, paired with the amount of times I would have had to move it, and the weaker and weaker it would have gotten with each move, it just did not make sense to keep it. And so I ended up lighting it on fire and burning it. Because keep in mind, sometimes even disposing of this stuff is itself a liability. Because you have to put it in a car and you have to take it to wherever you're taking it to get rid of it. Whether it's donating it or garbage, dumpster, place, whatever. So overall, these are just some factors for you to consider when you're going through some of your stuff, maybe that you have stored. And, I think you should really only analyze stuff with high liability. If it's got low liability, then the only liability about it is the fact that you are taking time out of your day to analyze whether or not you should keep it. Because time that you spend on thinking about something is itself a liability. So if let's say you have one small box that's filled up with a bunch of keychains, and you're looking at each keychain and analyzing it individually, that thing has no liability at all unless it's made out of toxic, hazardous material or something. It's a health risk. But that's just like a situation that's never going to happen. So because of the extremely small size of it, it has no liability itself, except for the fact that you are spending time thinking about whether or not to keep it, because then the time itself becomes a liability. So again, the only liability it had is the liability that you are artificially giving it because you're analyzing dumb stuff that you shouldn't be analyzing. I think you should only be, thinking about whether or not these factors apply to things that have high liability, like a desk in my example, or something else that you've had to move it for the third time and you're like, is this really worth keeping? I think that's the type of thing. In other words, things that cause problems in your life. And I'm the type of person that likes to really eliminate problems that don't need to be problems. And some problems kind of do need to be problems. If you have something that's high liability, but also high utility and high value or high value. But if something is high liability and high value, then you should sell it. Automatically just sell it. So for example, right now there's a second motorcycle in my storage unit that I didn't really seek out. I didn't buy it. I just kind of inherited it by means of somebody's repayment of debt. They repaid it by just giving me the motorcycle instead of paying me back what they owed. And so here I am with a second motorcycle that I don't necessarily want, in the sense that I certainly would not have paid its value for it had I just seen it for sale. And so it's got a high value, but it's also got a high liability in the sense that it's just sitting there taking up a lot of space in my storage unit. Sentiment is relatively low, pretty low. Aesthetics is low. It doesn't necessarily... I'm not keeping it because it looks good in my storage unit. That's certainly not a thing. I guess you could say aesthetics in a sense, because the bike itself looks good, but it's not... It's still low in a sense that it's not enough for me to want to keep it. Utility is basically none, because I already have a first motorcycle. I don't need a second one, really. Unless something happens to the first one, in which case we'll talk about it then. But even if something did happen to my first one, I would not want to replace it with the type of motorcycle that the second one is. I'd want to replace it with something else. So utility is virtually zero. Aesthetics under the conditions is basically zero. Sentiment, basically zero. Value is very high. Utility is very high. So that's something that you want to sell. You want to sell it immediately, right? If you have something that is pain in the ass to take care of and is really difficult to maintain, or just takes up a lot of space, or it's heavy and you don't want to keep moving it everywhere, and you find yourself in a situation where you do have to keep moving it frequently, then that's the type of thing where it's a problem, and you have to ask, is this worth keeping? Which makes you analyze the asset attributes, which are, what's the value, what's the utility, what's the sentiment, what's the aesthetics. If it has high value but none of the rest, just sell it. Sell it. Get rid of it. It's not worth stressing over. If it's high sentiment but nothing else, not high value, not high utility, not high aesthetics, then it's a harder one for sure. And like I said, this comes back to the situation with the desk, but it is a harder one for you to let go of, especially depending on why it's sentimental to you, right? It's harder to come to terms with letting go of. And I think whether or not you should let go of it depends on exactly how high the liability is. In my case, that desk would have taken up like a third of my storage unit space, and it just did not make sense to keep. It would have been more work than I was willing to put in to keep it for the sentimental value. If you have something that, you would live on the street before you sold that for money, then I guess we're in a different situation. It all depends on how sentimental that is to you and why it's sentimental to you. But I do think sometimes it can be a healthy practice to raise the threshold of what you're willing to keep merely and exclusively due to sentiment. I think there should be a higher threshold for that. I'm not saying you shouldn't or can't keep anything exclusively because of sentiment, even if it has a high liability. But I do think that sometimes it can be a healthy practice to raise the threshold, meaning, let's say you have 10 things that you are keeping for sentiment only. I think maybe you should look into getting rid of 3 or 4 of them based on, not just based on an arbitrary get rid of 40%, but based on having a high standard for what you keep just because of sentiment. Only things that are sentimentally important for this reason or for this reason. Or maybe you have 5 things that are sentimentally important for the same reason. Do you really need all 5 of them, or can you just keep 2 of them? Can having 2 of them still kind of fulfill the same need sentimentally or emotionally for you that having all 5 of them would have? These are just some questions you can ask yourself when it comes to the sentimental part. And, some people don't have the same sentimental attachments to things. I don't know that everyone does. I don't have it with everything, but I definitely have it with a lot of things. And I think I was just always more attached to things than I were to people. And I don't know, maybe there's some emotionally messed up part of that. But whatever the case, but at the same time, it kind of works out well, because a lot of the things that I'm sentimentally attached to just happen to have a whole lot of utility. For example, I have a bunch of power tools, lots of office equipment, technology, stuff like that, stuff that actually is useful and I wouldn't really have a reason to get rid of, and stuff that's usually relatively low liability in terms of size and weight and all that. So a lot of the stuff that I'm sentimentally attached to, I am only attached to because I've had it for so long. And the reason I've had it for so long is because it has had enough of a utility for me to keep it that long. So it kind of is like a circular feedback loop, which works out, I guess. Now, if you have something that's high liability and high aesthetics, I guess an example would be, I don't know, actually. I can't think of an example. Moving on. So you have something that's high value, high liability, sell it. You have something that's high liability, high sentiment, maybe keep it, but consider getting rid of it. Just go through the mental exercise of seeing how much you really need that, why you think you need it, and just consider the possibility. I'm not saying you have to, but just consider the possibility. You have something that's high utility and high liability. consider which one is more than the other. And in that case, it's really just a cost-benefit analysis, just strictly two factors. Is the benefit it's providing you through the utility more than what it's costing you through liability? And it can be financial on both sides, or it can be energy or time on both sides. For example, let's say you rent a storage unit. I've been talking about storage units a lot because it is a form of space that things can take up, making it therefore higher liability. But a storage unit itself can be something that you analyze, right? It might cost a lot of money per month, but the utility that is providing you is somewhere to store all your stuff. And so you have to ask whether or not that thing will be worth it. Usually it is. If it has high aesthetics and high liability, it's a harder one. I can't really think of something in the moment that would fall under that bucket. Maybe like a really large painting or something, but that's just kind of an obnoxious example, I guess. It's a harder one. I would say it depends on what kind of aesthetics it is and why you would want to, what kind of liability we're talking about. Is it financial liability? Is it something that can be replaced with something else that also has high aesthetics and lower liability? Like, I don't know. Is the liability only in terms of the space that it takes up? Is it financial? It would depend specific. I can't really give a blanket, get rid of it or keep it, response for that. It would really depend on what type of aesthetic it is and what type of liability it is. I guess a good example actually would be a stolen necklace or something like that, right? If you have a stolen necklace and you wear it around, let's say it's a really beautiful necklace, but you're on camera stealing it, or maybe you're not on camera stealing it, but people know that it's been stolen and are actively looking for it. Well, now you're wearing it around, it looks really good, but it's high liability because if you get caught with it, let's say it's not worth a whole lot except for sentimentally to somebody else, which is not value for you, or sentiment to you, it's sentiment to someone else, which doesn't factor into our equation here. So value is 0, sentiment is 0, utility is 0, but it's got high aesthetics, high liability because if you get caught with it, you're probably going to jail. That might not be worth keeping. So if we have high liability and just one of any of those other factors, the previous couple minutes is kind of how I would go into analyzing that. If we have a combination of those asset attributes, let's say, or if we have lower liability, if either of those two are the case, chances are higher that you're going to want to keep it. I'm surprised if anyone has made it this far into the episode, but this is more so just for people that frequently run into things where they're like, do I really need to keep this? I'm just basically breaking down the factors that you can think about and basically dissecting all the things that typically go through your head. I'm kind of categorizing them into ways that can make you more clearly analyze them in a more systematic way. And I like to do that frequently. I like to break things down and categorize them in all sorts of ways. I categorize everything. That's all for now with this, just a quick episode, and hopefully this has been helpful to you in some way.